Hello, everyone, and welcome to the episode 61 of the Office Hours podcast. We're happy to welcome back Matt, and I think we'll do a little cozy stream. I didn't even bother with any of the lighting. I got beautiful natural light, and before it's all gone, we wanted to do a quick sesh. I'm actually going on vacation on Thursday, so I'll be away for a while. And unfortunately, I don't have anything prepared in terms of the recording, but it's Christmas. Nobody's watching podcasts around Christmas anyway, so I hope it's fine.
Fair.
And we were talking last time after we wrapped up recording number 60, and I was like, hey, well, I mean, if we're going to be doing like the mentorship things on a phone, why not kind of just try and record it so you kind of get a chance to see what it would look like if you were to have a one-on-one with yours truly. So I guess without further ado, we can get on with it.
Yeah, might as well. Thanks for having me back 2 weeks in a row, by the way. Feel very special, very privileged to be doing that. So appreciate that. But yeah, so kind of like as we mentioned last week or whenever about the mentorship side of things, is that it, I feel like I've asked you quite a few questions already, like, oh, what would you look for if you were hiring somebody and that, but to not go too much deeper into those, I was wondering if I could ask you some kind of, I guess, just technology questions in the realm of front end, back end, that type of stuff, and your opinions on it,
Yeah,
or
yeah, yeah,
is that
absolutely.
cool with you? The first one's a bit more of like a warm up topic, I guess, in a way. So, kind of going through the program, you obviously learn like CSS and that, and then you kind of get exposed to SASS or SCSS, and then you can kind of take your own and go into Bootstrap and Tailwind and all that type of stuff. Do you use like, but I know like with just example, like newer versions, apparently CSS is up to version 4.15, even though everyone still just says CSS 3. I'm assuming that's because there's really a big gap or jump when they hit that version. Um, I don't even know if SASS is really required anymore. I feel like a lot of the stuff that people were using like a preprocessor for, they've started incorporating just into base CSS. Do you think it will be worth
Yeah,
it to keep using it, or do you guys use it for like where you work? If I or do you use anything like that, or do you just do? I'm just curious.
yeah, that's a good question actually.
Hmm,
In terms of CSS, like I haven't really followed too closely what's been happening with it,
sure.
and I think the whole big thing with SAS and the likes was that CSS didn't have variables, CSS didn't have hierarchical nesting, even though it's supposedly cascading style sheets. You have like
Yeah.
one level of hierarchy, so people ended up making all sorts of bizarre things to kind of pretend like it's you have like these nested things. Even I remember when I learned about CSS for the very first time, like way back,
Hmm.
before it didn't even make much sense to me at the time. But obviously, like I was at the very beginning of my engineering career, so that's fine.
Hmm.
And I thought that you're supposed to nest things inside one another, and then when I realized that you weren't, it was like, oh, that's kind of weird, but okay.
Yeah.
And so I think like they've added variables, and I remember hearing something about them having like an actual hierarchical style sheets now. So I
Yeah.
think
You can do like one or two tiers of nesting in like native CSS now, but if you go deeper, it can get a little buggy still, apparently.
right. I think the one thing that the SAS and SCSS and the like give you is that it's kind of like Babel for JavaScript, where you can transpile it down to like ES3, which is ancient, and you can kind of guarantee some form of backward compatibility,
Yeah.
because I imagine only the newest of the browsers are actively targeting the newest version of the spec, which is kind of becoming less of an issue now because Chrome kind of pretty much
Took over.
eliminated
Yeah.
all the competition, and Mozilla is being doing a bunch of really weird things lately. Like I mean, I'm an avid Firefox user. I've been using
Mm.
Firefox since before it was called Firefox.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it's been my primary browser. I kind of used it through the times when it was still pretty shitty and slow, and I was sort of gritting my teeth and was like, okay, it's gonna get better, but we can't have the repeat of the situation where back in the day, Internet Explorer was a dominant force, and everybody was dancing to the Microsoft's tune in terms of standards and all of that kind of stuff. And everyone said, like, you know what, this is not really fun. Let's not do that again. Let's diversify the browser landscape. But through some forces, it kind of coalesced back into just Chrome ruling pretty much 98%.
Yeah.
And
True, I've heard apparently like something like 80% of Mozilla's revenue comes from Google paying them to host like MDN and like their web docs for Chrome.
no, I think a lot of that money was coming because Google was default search in Firefox. So if you
Oh, I see.
install Firefox by default, anything you type in the address bar that is not an actual address would go through Google.
Gotcha.
But interestingly enough, there's been some lawsuit recently, some sort of antitrust thing, which cut that off. So Mozilla like lost a bunch of their money. And instead of focusing on the Firefox browser and the web, they're going into like activism and like all sorts of weird shit. I don't know. I'm vastly disappointed with what they're doing. They spent a bunch of money on some crazy rebrand, hiring like a design agency to change their logo into something unrecognizable. And it's like, is this really what you should be focusing on these days, guys? Like, you don't really have that much money and that much market share in terms of the browser. Rebranding is not really gonna help. And besides, you're rebranding the company, you're not rebranding the product. And most people who use Firefox probably know what Mozilla is, but besides that, I doubt it. I mean, a lot of developers use MDN, fair enough. I mean, it's a great site. I use it quite a lot myself. But yeah, anyway, that's kind of besides the point. So we're reaching the situation where we have like one predominant browser vendor, and so likely it gonna support all the latest and greatest things, because a lot of these, I imagine, are also being pushed out by, big companies. And in terms of like CSS version 4, I think pretty much since like the grids and flex, they add smaller things. Like there's nothing radically different about CSS. Well, I guess the hierarchical nesting is pretty radically different. But in terms of like new properties or new things that it does, it doesn't really feel like there's much. So it's kind
There's
of
a couple, even just from the me learning in the beginning and like kind of learning some of the newer stuff now. Like if you wanted to put like an overlay over an image or a video, you'd have to use like a pseudo selector and then just match it. But now you can just use like filter brightness and literally just essentially do that. So little things like that are apparently pretty new, but I know what you mean. There isn't like huge swaths of mega features that are just changing.
Yeah, because I don't really think that there's really that much to add, to be honest with you, because a lot of it kind of went to a stage where people come up with fancy things using like weird hacks and crutches, and people look at it and be like, that's actually pretty good. Let's try to incorporate it. And it has to go through all of these stages of like proposals and RFCs and all that, and eventually some of that stuff gets incorporated.
Kind of like what JavaScript did with jQuery, and jQuery did all this super useful, like just
and then JavaScript
easier stuff. They're like, that's a really good idea. Let's just do that. And
even then, even with that in mind, there's still a bunch of stuff that's like not in vanilla, and you think, guys, come on, it's been like 25 years. Just put it in already. So yeah, in terms of backwards compatibility, maybe it's kind of a moot point. I think we're firmly out of the times where, because now all the browsers auto update, and you can actually you can see the graphs of like one browser, like one version getting sunsetted, the next version comes right up, and they kind of gradually replace. So there's fewer and fewer people actually sticking to the older versions. And even now, the older versions are still supporting pretty much everything that you want them to support, except maybe like really fancy things. But so in terms of how well you should learn SASS, I mean, if you learn SASS and if you learn CSS, they're like,
they kind of go together.
Yeah, they do kind of go together. It's not like you're gonna learn SASS and it's like, oh my god, nobody's using SASS anymore. Well, it's been 95% CSS with just extra fancy stuff all along. So whatever.
No, exactly. That actually brings up another point though that you mentioned about the browsers is I can see from a monopoly standpoint, similar like what happened back to Microsoft in the 90s, that being a problem. But from a developer standpoint, like I've heard stories of people back in the day when they'd have to worry about, oh, and this is for Chrome, and then I have to do WebKit for this, and then I have to do that to make
Yeah.
sure everything across all the browsers or website looks the same, X, Y, and Z. Do you think there's any benefit to it being all in one versus like the rigmarole you'd have to go through back in the day to make sure that your website looked the way you wanted it to between Safari,
Yeah.
Edge, whatever?
That's a fair point. I think there was like this short transitionary period where the browser vendors didn't really want to go because maybe there was like not disagreement, but there's like lack of cohesion in
Mm,
terms of standardization. So browser vendors were like, well, we can't really say that this is an authoritative property name, but we're just going to put it behind our own namespace.
mm,
But we can develop the feature. And then if everybody else likes it, they're free to sort of incorporate it, and then it maybe gets standardized. I don't know exactly how that works. I imagine there's like a lot of political BS along the way.
probably.
And all of it was mostly compatible with one another, and we had those libraries that would like generate these huge chunks of CSS just to support like all the different browsers and
Like
kind of
normalized back in
backfill
the
the
day.
compatibility. Yeah,
Yeah.
that wasn't ideal, but I guess if that's the price of being able to innovate in that space, because
Mm,
like a lot of features, for instance, like web USB or web Bluetooth, Chrome supports it, like Firefox doesn't, right?
yeah.
But it's is it part of the standard? Not strictly speaking, I don't think so. So they're kind of doing their own thing, and you still need to say, oh, you know what? Wah wah, your browser does not support it, so kind of sucks to be you. Um, but funnily enough, on a surface, you think like web Bluetooth, like who the hell's gonna use that? But if you deal with any kind of embedded platform stuff, it's actually
Mm,
really useful. Like I have so many of these devices. Like I have these IoT ESP32 boards, which
mm,
are Bluetooth, and you literally just camera probably not gonna focus that
yeah.
close, but this thing essentially is like you can flash it over web Bluetooth through your browser without having to even plug it in. It's like that's pretty
Wow.
sweet, you
That is
know.
pretty sweet. Yeah.
So yeah, like so it is pretty cool. Um,
When you say flash, you mean like a firmware, like a BIOS
yeah,
flash?
you can you
Or
can you
oh
can
wow,
basically update it over the air directly from your
that's
browser. Yeah, that's
that is pretty dope.
it is pretty
Sorry.
dope. Yeah,
Yeah.
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 I mean, it doesn't
Um,
obviously it doesn't work for everything, but like a lot of
sure.
places, like yeah, just open our web flasher. Yeah, like I have a couple of just got some new hardware. I got some Meshtastic
Mm,
Meshtastic hardware for like mesh networking, and these
mm.
guys do their updates through like a web-based flasher as well, and you can just plug it in through web USB. You can connect your device, or you can do it over Bluetooth. So, what a time to be
Wow.
alive!
I know. Crazy. That's pretty cool though. I didn't even know that was a possibility. That's I can see a lot of applications for that though. In like
Hmm.
the tech space anyway, but I don't
Yeah,
know if
yeah.
anyone will ever get to a point
I
where they
mean,
feel cool.
I imagine it's quite a serious attack surface expansion at the same time. So it's
For sure.
kind of
Yeah.
here, sort of.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, what are you gonna do?
Yeah. That's always how it's gonna be, unfortunately, I think. I guess so. Yeah, the next thing would be, I guess, because as me and you have discussed, I'm doing a lot more front end and like this design side of things, whereas um, I would argue there's more, maybe not more want of full stack developers, but I feel like a lot of people get hired to do one and they kind of just get relegated into thinking they need to do both in a lot of companies, or they're just trying to hire
Hmm.
one person to do two jobs or anything along those lines. Going from front end into back end, would you say there's a specific thing to focus on, like a technology that you want to spend your time learning, like whether it is a different language like Node or Python or some other server side stuff that you think would be super helpful, just anything like that that you think would be the first thing to go to?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that so. I mean, backend is a pretty expansive area, as
Tell me
is
about
front end,
it.
right?
Yeah.
So I think broadly what happened historically is like before 2000s, there were barely any front end per se. It was like, oh, we have a web page. We used Macromedia Dreamweaver to put it
Yeah.
together. Or, oh my God, the horrible Word documents save as web or something like that, which produced absolutely atrocious amounts of like CSS that was super weird. And then you can publish it in the internet because it gave you like an HTML file. It
Yeah.
looked terrible, but hey, that's how it was. And so you had your like 3-tier architecture developers, but then web started growing rapidly in terms of technologies used, and it,
Hmm.
it necessitated kind of just dedicating yourself to just that. So it sort of branched out. And before web developers, there were web designers, which means you know how to use like Illustrator and Photoshop, and you can cut
Or
like some
Flash.
sort or Flash, yeah, or Flash, man, Flash, yeah.
Oh man.
You could do all of those things, and you don't necessarily even know how to do backend and protocols because that was pre JSON and pre like website talking back to the server without reloading the page, because everything is just like, hey, it's a page load. You want to do something? Well, you got to load a new page.
Yeah.
So, and now I guess everybody wants a little bit of everything, and
Mm.
full stack is, I don't know, is it kind of back? It feels like a lot of these things that they're like some discipline starts forming sort of at the periphery, and
Mhm.
then it balloons into completely its own thing. So like it necessitates a separate person doing it, and
Yeah.
then parts of it kind of get reabsorbed into this mythical developer who knows how to do everything perfectly
Yeah.
well. And so in terms of backend, if we just stick to like the web development side, first of all, I think it's worthwhile to understand the basics in terms of like protocols. Like, how does the front end actually communicate with the web? Like, what's involved there? How
Mhm.
does HTTP work? And all of the fancier, newer versions of it. Because there has been also this trend of sort of abandoning text based protocols and going into something more complicated that is more dense, because like HTTP 1.1 is trivially understood by most people, but quick, and I don't know what was the HTTP 2.0. There was like a different protocol that they were using, and now HTTP 3 is like quick, which is binary based. It's like TLS by default, multiplexing. Like all of those things are kind of part of the protocol,
Mhm.
which still pretends to be just doing gets and posts, but it's different enough that it pays to understand how that works. It
Okay.
pays to understand the chain in between like the server and the browser. Like, how does the content get delivered? Like, how it works in terms of like browser limitations in terms of fetching the content from various places. In latest years, there's been a lot of emphasis on security and mitigating various like attacks like cross-site forgery. So you need to understand cores and why it's there and what it's for and how to deploy it. And like, so there's like a lot of stuff that even doesn't touch the actual language used to produce it. It's like the
Yeah.
thing that moves the data back and forth, right? Or like
Mhm.
WebSockets, or like all of these things. I think it's worthwhile having an understanding of what it's all built upon, and then you can kind of expand into actual server side parts of it. So if you're working toward it from the web front end part of you, it's like, okay, well, you have your web application. Maybe it's a single page application, maybe not. Most likely these days it is gonna be. It's gonna like use some API. So let's understand what's in between, like proxies, API gateways, SSL termination, like all of these different things. And then from there, it's like, oh, now we're hitting the actual application running. And then on the other side of that application, there could be like a database connection, some sort of cache connection, or all of these other things, right?
Mhm.
And you kind of start going at it from that end. Um,
Makes sense. That way, it does make it a little bit more linear and almost
yeah, yeah,
like
yeah,
a
yeah.
pipeline in a way. Yeah.
There's this website which, oh my god,
I think you've shared it with me. Is it the like
yeah, the whole blueprint thing.
Yeah, with
which
the
kind
like
of like
a
outlines.
path. It shows you like do X, Y, and
Yeah,
Z.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. The
yeah,
different paths. I do remember that I shared it. I remember that I shared it recently. I just don't like with that. I
yeah.
guess it was with you, but yeah. If I'll try to remember the name exactly. I'll put it in the in the description so
I think
people
I
can find
favorited it
it.
somewhere, so I can send it to you when we're done.
Yeah, 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 yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
But because there's just so much, and if you start
yeah.
branching out into all the different things right away, it could be quite overwhelming.
Mm.
Um, in terms of languages and technologies, I almost like to say it doesn't really matter that much, but it kind of sort of does. I think just for convenience, it would make sense to sort of stick with JavaScript on both ends at the same time because you have JavaScript here, you have JavaScript there. You don't need to learn a whole new language just to understand it. I mean, it is a different paradigm because most of backend coding is async fashion these days.
Hmm.
So, and on the front end, if you're not doing business logic, you're probably not gonna do much async. You'll do callbacks and things like that, but maybe not much async. So it takes some kind of wrapping your head around it. It's not too bad. But if you use some other language like Python's pretty popular. I mean, a ton of
Hmm.
people still use PHP. WordPress is,
All PHP.
alive and
Well, not
kicking.
anymore. They've started getting like with their block editor. I don't know if you've been following like what they've been doing with. So essentially, their block editor is essentially a REST API React app that
Right, right.
starting to get away from PHP. But then I think they
But the
wanted to
backend, the
close out.
backend for it is still gonna be PHP, right?
For now, they've actually trans. That's mostly HTML now,
Mm,
except for certain things. So
right,
but the way they build it, like their template architecture, is still the same. It's HTML versus PHP.
right, right,
Yeah.
right, right. And yeah, there's this trend again into, we started with everything's rendered on a server as an individual page. And if you want to do anything, you have to preserve the state and load the next page based on that state. Then we went like whole hog with SPAs, like a single page app where the entire application is client side. It just talks to some API. And
Hmm.
now there's a mix of both. So there's like server side rendering, server side hydration, islands. I haven't even really investigated into those, but like if you use something like Astro, they have these islands, which are like the server side parts intermingled with client side parts and are all supposed to work. But there's been like this big loop around where it's like, oh, we have a mainframe with a thin client, but now we're migrating the thin client back into the mainframe. It's like, oh, no, we used to have like a single page app with the API on a server, but now we're moving parts of it back to the server because we need SEO and we need server side rendering and all of these things. So it's very cyclical in that.
It's funny because that actually ties into my next question, which actually comes down to because I like learned React and messed around with Vue a little bit in the program, but then there are so many people that are going like, oh, well, like the next thing to do between React is to like get onto Next.js, which is a React framework that's all about server side rendering. Funnily
Mm-hmm.
enough, I was actually going to talk about how it's kind of like you said, cyclical. It's kind of come back to server side rendering, and I've actually seen a couple of examples, funnily enough, for SEO where people actually tracked it and looked at their making sure it's getting indexed, and you could see that when it was crawled, it literally all it showed was like the root div that you would get on a React page load.
Yeah.
Versus like if it was server side, then it would actually hydrate properly and then
Mm-hmm.
actually crawl it. Um, Other than what you just said, SEO, is there any reason why you think things are going back and forth, or just
I think it's, well, people always chase performance. And, you know, in the era of SPAs, usually you're greeted with like a loader. First thing you see is like a loader or like a bunch of loaders. Everything's spinning and then stuff starts popping up on your page.
yeah?
And people would, understand that this is not ideal for. Okay, as a aside, like all of this stuff is primarily driven by e-commerce. And any kind of delay or disruption drastically reduces the probability that the customer will part with their hard-earned cash to buy something on a website.
I forget what the metric is, but it's something like for every 0.3 seconds someone has to wait, it costs X amount of money or something like that.
Yeah, I
it's
think
actually pretty substantial.
It's like an additional 100 millisecond is like a 50% drop. I don't remember the figures, but it is substantial. Like the longer you have to wait for stuff to appear, the more likely you are to move elsewhere.
Mhm.
And I think the 15-second TikTok videos aren't helping in the overall trend, you know. The attention span is shrinking to that of a goldfish.
Give me a second.
Yeah.
I'm just jumped. I'm kidding. That was just my attention span. Anyway.
Oh,
yeah, it's all good.
Like squirrel.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and so like, yeah, waiting for things to load. People don't want to wait for things to load. But funnily enough, psychologically, you can wait for things to load if you have something to do in the meantime. I don't know, there's this fellow who's been ahead of some marketing agency. He's like a lot of shorts. He's publishing like a lot of shorts about like the restaurant business in one way. He's like talking about like all the different things they do to kind of make you part with your money more likely. And he was talking about elevators where in some corporate high rise, people were complaining that the elevators take way too long. And they almost had like a massive contract with one of those elevator manufacturers to install like high-speed elevators, blah, blah, blah. And then somebody suggested like, just deck out the lobby in mirrors wall to wall. And the complaints went down because people just prefer looking at themselves like, you know, messing around with their hair while waiting for their elevator. So now they're not waiting for the elevator. They have something to do, right? And so if a portion of your website is already showing and they can already start reading something, they don't care as much that the rest of it is still kind of slowly popping up together.
Like giving everyone a fidget spinner just while they wait for something, yeah.
Pretty much. I mean, I have so many things on my desk that can be used as a fidget spinner that I do all the time. So, like, no wonder, you know?
Yeah.
And with that in mind, I think that kind of, it brings us back to the whole server-side rendering. It's definitely very good for SEO. I know that Google, some time ago, they basically started effectively running JavaScript to kind of understand what the site looks like once it's fully loaded. But again, not every search engine has that capacity. So, and you kind of want to give them what they want as soon as they want it. And so it is happening right now. In terms of learning Next is a very quirky thing. One thing I dislike about Next is the fact that it's basically Vercel's funnel into getting you to use their paid services.
That's what I've heard.
And pretty much everything surrounding that ecosystem is tailored to that goal. Oh, it's like, oh, you want to use Turbo Repo? Well, you could, but unless you pay for the Turbo Repo, whatever server-side thing, the caching is just going to be ass. And like, just pay us money, you know, like it's all good. And with Next, it's like, oh, you want to deploy it somewhere outside of Vercel? Yeah, I guess you could do that. We're just not going to give you any documentation about how to do it right, and half of stuff is not going to work. And our Edge runtime is just so bizarre. Ha 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 ha. Nothing really works there besides a couple of things that we sort of expressly allow you. And it's just like, oh my God. I mean, I get it. Like, they're a company, they want to make money, but the degree to which they are in cahoots with like React core team and how much their desires is driving overall direction of React is kind of like I'm not exactly excited about it. I mean, we are using Next.js in my current projects, but I can't say that it's all sunshine and rainbows. Like, again, there's downsides to everything. And, you know, with Next.js in 2024, the end result looks suspiciously like what I had in 2004 with PHP on Apache, you know? Like, I could have achieved all the same things there as I could now, only with like 1/3 of the hassle.
It's funny you say that because one of my professors did the same thing. It was like when he was talking about like going into React, was like constantly just like referencing back. It's like, or you could just do it in vanilla with this without half the abstraction, or you
Yeah.
can mess around with all of this
I
stuff.
mean, it could be potentially like an old man yells at cloud type situation as
Yeah,
well.
exactly.
It's like, damn kids, get off my lawn.
Yeah,
But I mean, yes and no. It's always that meme with the goose. It's like
yeah,
front end is very complicated. It's like, but who made it complicated, huh?
yeah, yeah,
It's like, yeah, we made it complicated, and I think I brought it up recently, so I feel like I'm
yeah,
repeating myself. But
yeah. No, I hear you. But would you say, I guess that's the thing, is like going from, I guess, React to Next, if I were to try and make that jump, what would you say would be the things to focus on? You think would be hardest to kind of wrap my head around? Some things that might be a little bit easier.
so again, they pretend like it's very easy.
Hmm.
It's just React. It's just React, bro. Server side, client side, who cares? But this thing, it's very unobvious because you can't immediately tell if something is a server side code or client side code, and they do behave differently.
Hmm.
And if
Interesting.
you think that you can just share code between server side and client side easily, it's not gonna always work, but they kind of create this expectation that it will.
Okay, that's
And then you
interesting.
have some server side stuff leaking into client side because, oh, you just imported a file that happens to import another file that happens to import some server side crap, and now your entire website just breaks because, oh, I can't find module fs read file sync or something. You're like, where the hell is this coming from? It's like, oh, it's a chain of imports that just happened to grab the server side stuff that didn't get tree shaken correctly, and now everything's broken. And now we even have like a naming convention where it's like something.client.ts and something.server.ts because they are different, and if you put them together, stuff is gonna break, and it's unobvious. And so yeah, it's like there's a lot of marketing hype about it. I mean, you can build pretty pretty sophisticated uh projects with it. I'm not
Mhm.
denying that. It's just that it's not as nice as the marketing materials seem to suggest. It's not without its pains. There are other frameworks. I haven't really tried them necessarily, so I can't like vouch for other ones. But it's not the only player in town with the ability to do server side rendering and like SSG and all of those things.
Mhm.
And I feel that in a fashion similar to Ruby on Rails, it allows for a lot, but there is a big chunk of things that it completely does not allow for, and there's nothing you can do about it.
Oh,
So
really?
if you bought into that ecosystem, if you try to do those things, there is no way, like,
Hmm.
or at least not without significant amount of effort that nobody in their sane mind would attempt to do. Um, like if you try to do something that is not supported by the Edge runtime, well, you can't. Sorry, everything's abstracted to such a level that you cannot inject the things that you want to do into their request processing pipeline, and that's it. Like, you know, if you build an entire project and now you need this thing, well, sorry, you can't have that thing. You have to rebuild it in someplace else from ground up.
Well, that doesn't
Whereas
sound
if you build something yourself and you understand how it works, you would have better degree of flexibility of you know, how to make it happen.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's the thing with like any level, and I think you and I have talked about this too, is that like the more and more abstracted things get to make things easier overall, if that knowledge of how it's actually getting done isn't there, then when something does go wrong, or you do need to have that flexibility and you don't know how to do it, then that becomes
Yeah, yeah.
problematic,
It,
obviously.
it, it's very nice as long as you color inside the lines.
Gotcha. That's a very good way to put that, actually. I like that. I don't know why it just popped back into my brain when we were talking about like browsers earlier on in our
Hmm.
conversation, but like the fact that the Canadian government still uses Internet Explorer and half the stuff you can't do like on the CRA, if you have Chrome, it'll actually tell you come back. Not with Edge, with Internet Explorer is mind-boggling to me, but actually still a thing.
Hmm.
Like just as an example, I have a friend who works for the federal government and they just finished upgrading from Windows XP to Windows 10, which Microsoft said they were stopping support for, I think, next year or this year. Like they gave like the alarm
Mm-hmm.
last year to say they're going to stop doing it. Like I think you can still pay for extended
Yeah.
coverage or
Yeah.
whatever it is, but like I don't know. Like I guess coming back to what we said, like if everyone starts saying developing everything for Chrome, and then there is another big shift, and then does it become there be that issue where similar to the government, they're still built off everything off of Internet Explorer, and it won't work with
Yeah.
anything new. I realize the technology's come quite far since then, obviously, so that may not have the same issue as you said. So many different ones they
But
kind of play nice
yeah,
together.
it's true. There's many. I remember working on a project where our deployment, the end user basically had to access it through a Citrix corporate, effectively thin client screen sharing type application that sits somewhere inside their data center, and it's limited to Internet Explorer. So you're like using like a remote desktop type thing, which is like slow and painful, and all you have is Internet Explorer. And it was just like, alrighty then. Well, I guess we have to support Internet Explorer. Uh, and it was like a few years, like 4 years ago maybe. So it wasn't.
That's
It's
still pretty
still
recent
pretty
though. Like,
recent. Exactly,
yeah.
exactly. So that was a fun experience. But those are few and far between. Usually they're reserved to like either government or some industrial or some sort of financial sector. But in terms of CRA, in terms of their like regular person experience, I haven't really reached any places where you can't use Chrome. But I do find the message that if you try to log into CRA website after hours, it's like, sorry, we're 9 to 5 only. It's like, what?
What is the point of having a website?
Exactly.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah.
I was traveling
Uh,
abroad in a time zone which was just completely 180 from where I was, and it's like,
mhm.
oh yeah, I have to get up in the middle of the night just to access the website because I don't know, it's a union thing, I guess, or what's the deal with
I
that?
have no idea, but it makes no sense. It makes
It's
no sense. I have no idea.
like, yeah.
Uh, well, I guess the thing for me too is like my mom's side of the family is Estonian, so I've been over there, and when they're
They have a huge
finally
thing on digital government, don't they, in Estonia?
oh, it's the amount that like they are interconnected and what you're able to do with essentially just like they each get their
Digital
ID card,
ID,
which
yeah,
has
yeah.
like an RFID, and then they have like a USB adapter everyone can just slide your card into, and then that will authorize, and
Yeah,
then you can literally just do everything that you do through the TRA, but you don't need to send them fucking fax or whatever
yeah,
crazy ass
yeah, yeah.
backwards.
Yeah,
Um,
I heard about that. I mean, BC has their own BC authenticator thing
yeah.
that you can sign up for. But that doesn't work everywhere,
Mhm.
sadly. But I mean, it works for some things, which is, I guess, is kind of nice. Um, and yeah, yeah. The thing is, I don't know. It's I'm probably gonna offend some people, but it reminded me of that old meme about like the country music, where there's like two producers like, you know, the things that people are like in music. What if we made it not like that? So it's like the government websites that work between 9 and 5. It's like you know how people want to access it all the time. Like, what if we
Yeah.
don't do that? It's like,
Yeah.
Jesus Christ, guys, get on with the program.
Oh yeah. Oh, that's pretty funny. But yeah. Makes no sense. At least
Yeah,
to me. I'm trying to think of other things. So those are kind of like my big three questions that I came up with and did a little bit of research
yeah,
on.
yeah.
Anything from you?
Yeah, I think if you go into React more, and
Mhm.
it's kind of the echoes of the stuff that I was working on today, but it's really easy to arrive at bad performance in a React application
Mm,
because I think people don't really not understand, but they don't appreciate how you're supposed to structure these things for optimal performance.
okay.
It's I know it's kind of vague, but it's just so easy to build a React application that just performs like absolute sack of potatoes. And
If you had a performance budget you'd set for say any web site, what would you set it at? Just as I realize it can fluctuate depending on what the website is, obviously. But
Well, obviously you don't want everything to freeze as you start typing in a text box. At least that, that would be good.
That would be good.
Yeah, that would be good. And it's heavily optimized to understand what needs to be re-rendered and what doesn't need to be re-rendered on a component level. So if you end up with this Frankenstein's monster of a component that has like 25 different hooks in it and a bunch of functions that render different fragments, it's going to perform like crap. Like actually extract those things into their own components and make sure that whatever happens inside those components does not perturb what happens in other components as much as possible, because otherwise you just like all those problems float right back. And I've been kind of railing on React with their hooks thing. I don't know how much experience you had in using the hook thing.
Which ones are you talking about?
Like React hooks, like use state,
like use effect, use
state. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Man, I was talking about the nice natural light, and now the sun.
I feel like it literally just started blasting you in the face.
It started blasting. I'm like clipping all over the place, but it's okay.
Yeah. But yes, no. So that's part of.
Yeah.
I think using to learn it, because I feel like use state was a big one for me. Like at the beginning, being like, oh, I don't know, why do you need to make a new array? Why don't you just change it? And then like, so I understand a whole part of that now. But that was shifting from, I guess, vanilla to React was a big.
And I think to a larger extent, it's hooks make things less obvious. They feel like they do, but they don't. Because the internal semantics are tricky and you kind of really have to understand it. And the thing is, it's kind of funny. Like if you're just entering into this discipline now, there's literally been 20 years of like, hey, mixing UI and business logic all in the same place is not a good idea. Let's find a way to separate them. And then React comes in, it's like, nah, it'll be fine, and just puts it right back.
Yeah. Thanks, Facebook.
Well, yeah. I don't even know if it's necessarily Facebook at this point. Like,
no, I know, but they were the
no, they were, but
progenitor,
like,
were they not?
They were the progenitor, but where it comes from, like, I understand sort of the thinking that guided them in doing this, but I feel like, again, it's so easy to get yourself to a state where there's just a lot of problems and you don't quite understand how to solve them. And no amount of use memo or use callback is going to get you out of that hole, because architecturally what you've built is wrong. And my current approach is to attempt to firmly separate the logic, the business logic, from presentation and not bolt them together as much as possible, because it's a trade-off. Again, there's some things that is like very easy to do. I think that the problem with hooks in a way is that it's easy to do easy things, but as soon as you kind of have to refactor them to do something a little bit harder, then the refactoring gets progressively more and more complex. Sorry, I'm going to try to shut down the shutters because it's,
I was going to say, looks like it's getting a little aggressive.
Ridiculous, yeah.
Yeah.
At the same time, I want my face to still be somewhat lit. I don't know.
I can still see you. I think I only have my monitor brightness at like 50%, so it's not like your Nosferatu in the back just creeping or anything like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Where was I? Oh yeah, like getting into weird performance issue and weird refactoring patterns. It's like, oh, I have a hook at this very low level, but now the functionality necessitates that all of the logic is like shifted one level above. And then some functionality necessitates that it gets shifted one level above, right? And then eventually you accumulate this massive thing that tries to deal with all of the different complications of your business logic. And in the end, it's really hard to follow. Whereas if you did not have your logic bolted to the UI, you could focus on building the components that are simply there to present stuff. And React is really good at doing that. So, yeah. I know that if you haven't like directly experienced it, it might be hard to understand the
No, I kind of
the
get that,
idea
and
behind it.
I'll say they do a good job of trying to really hammer in the fact that if
Hmm.
you can essentially make your code as modular as possible, whether it's modules or components and X, Y, and Z, instead of just having some giant monolith
Hmm.
spaghetti code thing. I kind of get that from a standpoint because obviously where you work, I'm sure that the code base you guys is on is like ginormous compared to anything that I've ever worked on or seen. So to the level you're talking about, might be hard for me to really internalize that, but I have an idea of what you're saying.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And in fact, I would even say it's like uh, paraphrasing. It's like the good code base is not when there's nothing more to add, but when there's nothing left to remove. So you have to keep it. You have to keep it simpler.
Yeah.
And yeah, I've been digging through some code that is overly complicated for no good reason.
Mm,
And I think that kind of boils back to something that we were talking before, where you iterate and iteration creates complexity. And when you finish iterating on solving a problem, you leave it in a state of this increased complexity. You're like, oh, well, I solved the problem. All of the
yeah.
intermediate steps, like all of the stuff that you've built on top of one another, it's like it solves my current problem. Good. Right. But with experience you kind of get to a stage where you can kind of iterate without actually writing code, and then you take the final solution and then you can clean it up a little bit so it doesn't have all the cruft, and then you lay it out, right?
Yeah.
So, and that's the difficult part, right? Is like the ability to actually, once you've arrived at the solution, sort of take a big what's the word I'm looking for, the big picture,
Like take a step back
the
and
bird's eye view. I was
yeah.
going to say the big bird view, but it's like, wait,
Yeah.
that doesn't make sense. The bird's eye view of it, and understand what is actually relevant to how the problem is solved, and get rid of everything else.
Yeah.
And yeah,
And I'm sure that takes like anything many years to kind of get there. And that I feel like that comes with
yeah, yeah,
any skill realistically is
yeah,
being
yeah.
able to go from
It's like following things to their logical conclusions and not leaving halfway through.
yeah.
It's like, yeah, yeah,
But I'll because similarly, because I think that comes back to when you're first doing things, kind of like you're saying, you kind of get to a point where like, oh, I got it working, and you're like, I'll worry about fixing it and making it more performant after the fact. But I feel like a lot of people don't go back through that, like you were saying, they just kind of
yeah.
like, I got it working. Um,
Normally, you kind of almost never go back,
yeah,
except the times when you need to go back, and then you're like, oh my god, who wrote this? It's
yeah.
like, oh,
Like, oh, I did.
of
God
course I
damn
know
it.
him.
Yeah,
It was me.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So yeah, I
Yeah.
think that's about where it is, and
Yeah.
probably would be like a good time to wrap it up.
I'd say so. Yeah,
All right. Well,
cool.
thank you so much for your time and for the questions.
Of
And
course, I hope they were at least marginally intelligent.
no, they were very valid questions, and I hope that the answers were useful to you and maybe to whoever is watching this. So we hope you enjoyed this and come back
Yeah,
for the next one, and we'll see you then. It'll probably be, I guess, in the new year. I don't know
that'd be good.
if there will be time to record something. Oh man, it kind of feels like such a big gap because it's only mid. Well, I guess it's mid December, so 2 weeks.
Yeah,
We'll be back in a couple of weeks anyway.
yeah.
So with that in mind, have great holidays, Merry Christmas ahead of time, and
Happy non-denominational holidays, or
yes,
whatever you want to
yes,
go with. Yeah,
and yeah, Happy New Year. I guess we'll see you in 2025. What a thought. All
yeah.
right, thank you and
Thanks again for having me.
goodbye.
Bye, everybody.